September 5th, 1944. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stepped through the doors of his old headquarters in the West for the first time in 2 months. The building felt familiar, but the summons did not. In July, he had been dismissed after telling Hitler's staff, too bluntly, too honestly, that Normandy was lost and that Germany should seek peace. Now, the Führer was calling him back. Rundstedt didn't need anyone to explain what that meant. When a regime punishes you for telling the truth, then begs you to return, it's because the truth has finally caught up with them. General Günther Blumentritt, the chief of staff for the German forces in the West, was waiting with maps spread flat across a table like a body on an operating slab. The maps told their story without raising a voice. 6 weeks earlier, the Allies had broken out of Normandy. What followed wasn't a steady withdrawal. It was a flood. American and British columns were sweeping across France faster than German planners had thought physically possible. Cities that had been pins on a staff map were now names in frantic radio messages. The front line, once drawn in confident strokes, now looked like a torn thread. Blumentritt tapped the southern sector, the American Third Army, George Patton. In 3 weeks, Patton had driven more than 400 miles. His lead elements were now roughly 100 miles from Germany's border, and between them and the Rhine, there was nothing substantial, nothing a staff officer could point to with confidence and say, here is where we stop him. Rundstedt stared at the map, not because he didn't understand it, but because he did. Then he asked the question whose answer was already written into every frightened silence in the room. What do we have to stop him with? Blumentritt didn't decorate the truth. He didn't soften it with talk of elastic defense or temporary setbacks. He said one word, flat and final: nothing. The German military situation in early September of 1944 was desperate in a way that is often misunderstood, even by people who know the broad outline of the war. This was not merely a retreat. It was the near-total collapse of German military power in Western Europe. And on that day, September 5th, Rundstedt and Blumentritt were looking at the most dangerous kind of battlefield truth, the kind you cannot fix with speeches, ideology, or orders screamed into telephones. Between Patton's forward positions and the German frontier, there were no intact German divisions. None. The Wehrmacht formations that had fought in France were destroyed, shattered into fragments, or fleeing east in disorder. Heavy equipment lay abandoned in ditches and fields. Burned trucks, broken artillery, tanks out of fuel and out of hope. Units that still existed on paper had lost the cohesion that makes a unit more than a crowd. A battalion without radios, without supplies, without officers, it trusts is not a battalion. It is a group of armed men trying to survive. And then there was the Siegfried Line, Germany's western belt of fortifications, the concrete teeth that propaganda had once portrayed as impenetrable. The bunkers were still there, yes, but years earlier, troops and weapons had been stripped from the line to feed the Eastern Front. Concrete remains even when strength is gone. What Rundstedt faced in September was a wall made of empty shells. No ammunition stocks, no proper garrisons, no trained crews ready to turn those bunkers into a killing zone. A pillbox without men is a tomb waiting to be filled. To understand the German mindset, you have to picture the roads. This was not a disciplined withdrawal with rear guards and planned demolition lines. German officers described scenes that sounded like the breakdown of a state. Columns of vehicles jammed for miles, horse-drawn carts overturned into ditches, fuel trucks burning, sending oily smoke into late summer skies, soldiers tossing rifles aside because a weapon is heavy and fear is heavier. There was no reliable radio contact, no coherent chain of command, just a shared instinct to get across the Rhine before the Americans closed the trap. For an officer corps that prided itself on order, this wasn't only defeat, it was humiliation. In the years after the war, German commanders were remarkably candid about how weak they were in those first days of September. In post-war studies and interrogations conducted by American historians, they supplied details that strip away any illusion that Germany still held a solid line in the West. General Siegfried Westphal, an operations officer at OB West headquarters, later estimated that on September 1, 1944, the entire Western Front had the effective combat strength of roughly 10 to 12 divisions. That number sounds respectable until you understand what it hides. A German division on paper was supposed to be around 17,000 men. These divisions were often battered, remnants with 2,000 to 5,000 exhausted soldiers, short on ammunition, short on fuel, short on artillery, short on everything that makes a formation capable of stopping an armored army that smells blood. Against this, Patton's Third Army alone fielded roughly a dozen divisions, many close to full strength, aggressively led, and backed by air superiority so complete that German movement in daylight had become a gamble with death. The arithmetic was merciless. Even if German divisions had been full strength, they would have been hard-pressed. But they were not full strength. And worse, they were not positioned to absorb a blow. A broken army cannot choose where it fights. It fights where it collapses. The most critical issue was reserves. In military terms, reserves are the force you keep back for the moment of crisis. The unit that plugs a breach, the armored fist that slams into an enemy spearhead, the insurance policy that prevents catastrophe from becoming annihilation. In early September, Germany had no meaningful reserves in the West. Blumentritt later stated that there were no panzer divisions available for immediate deployment anywhere between the Channel and the Swiss border. The armored units that had fought in Normandy were destroyed, or they existed as skeletons being rebuilt far behind the front in Germany. A few formations were still assigned to the West on paper, but at 20% strength or still forming, they were not forces you could throw into a gap within hours. This was fatal, because stopping an armored breakthrough requires armored counterattack. Infantry can dig in and delay. They can die slowly and buy time. But they cannot run down and smash fast-moving tank columns in open country. For that, you need panzers. And in those early days, there weren't any. Westphal was blunt in post-war testimony. Germany had no reserves, no prepared positions, and no coherent defense line ready to be manned in time. If Patton had continued his advance in early September, German forces could not have stopped him short of the Rhine, and perhaps not even there, depending on how quickly the shock spread. German intelligence, even in chaos, remained skilled at tracking Allied movements. They knew where Patton was. They knew the pace of his advance. They also knew, with growing dread, that the only thing restraining him was not German firepower, but American supply lines stretching like thin rope behind a sprinting army. 2 days after returning to command, Rundstedt sent a situation report to Hitler's headquarters. He had used those 2 days to tour the shattered front and listen to frightened staff officers admit what no one wanted to say. The report was pessimistic, even by the grim standards of late-war German communications. Rundstedt warned that if the Americans continued pushing, German forces would be unable to prevent a Rhine crossing within roughly 2 weeks. He requested immediate reinforcement, at least 10 fresh divisions, preferably armored. The response from Hitler's staff was not reassurance. It was a question that exposed the emptiness behind every demand. Where would those divisions come from? The Eastern Front was bleeding. There were no strategic reserves. Rundstedt was told, in effect, to perform a miracle with rubble. Then something happened that German commanders could not understand at first. Patton's advance slowed over the course of several days, then nearly stopped. Third Army units that had been racing forward at 30 to 40 miles per day were now sitting along roadsides or creeping only a few miles at a time. German signals officers monitoring American radio traffic began to pick up an unfamiliar theme: fuel shortages, tanks immobilized, operations curtailed, units consolidating rather than lunging forward into the open space that lay ahead, like a door left unlocked. At first, German commanders suspected deception. Patton had a reputation, even among his enemies, for misdirection and violent surprise. Perhaps the Americans wanted the Germans to believe Third Army was stuck, while preparing a sudden crushing thrust. But as the days passed and the American spearheads remained largely stationary, the Germans realized this was no trick. Patton had been stopped by logistics, not by German resistance. In Rundstedt's headquarters, the relief was real enough to be felt in the air. It was not joy. It was the sensation of a man hearing the footsteps of an executioner, and then, impossibly, hearing those footsteps turn away. For the German staff, it was as if a blade had hovered over their necks and then paused, not because they had raised a shield, but because the blade had run out of strength to swing. For American tank crews, the moment was surreal. For weeks, their world had been motion. Engines roaring, tracks clanging, dust clouds rising behind columns as they chased a collapsing enemy. Then, the chase went quiet. Thousands of men sat beside roads in late summer heat, staring at maps that showed nothing ahead but empty space. They could feel the enemy was broken. They could sense that the road to the Rhine was open. But the fuel gauges were sinking toward zero like a countdown to disappointment. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, like the moment you realize you are holding a winning ticket you cannot cash. In post-war memoirs and interrogations, German commanders described Patton's early September halt in language that bordered on the mystical. These were not sentimental men. They were professional officers trained to search for rational explanations. Yet the words they chose, again and again, suggested the event felt like salvation, delivered without cause. They referred to it as a miracle in the West, echoing an older German habit of describing unexpected reprieves as if fate itself had intervened. Rundstedt wrote later that the halt of Third Army in early September was inexplicable from a military standpoint. Patton had strength, position, and momentum. That he did not reach the Rhine when Germany was weakest was, in his words, a gift Germany had no right to expect. Blumentritt was even more direct under American questioning. He stated that when Patton was halted, German commanders could not understand it. The Americans had stopped themselves at the precise moment when Germany was most vulnerable and least able to resist. And the German staff did not waste the reprieve. Between early September and late November of 1944, they executed a remarkable reconstruction of their Western defenses. This is not post-war fantasy. Allied intelligence observed it in real time and grew alarmed at how quickly Germany recovered once the front stabilized. The first priority was simple: man the Siegfried Line. Units that had been retreating in disorder were gathered, reorganized, and pushed into the empty bunkers. Training battalions were rushed forward. Luftwaffe ground crews, men who had never expected to fight as infantry, were formed into improvised formations. Kriegsmarine personnel were handed rifles and told the war had come to them. The West became a magnet for whatever manpower could be scraped together. By late September, the line had gone from hollow concrete to a real defensive position. imperfect but dangerous. The second priority was rebuilding armored strength. German tank production remained significant in late 1944. The problem had been getting tanks to the right place and forming them into units that could fight. A stabilized front gave time to repair, to reorganize, to train crews, to accumulate fuel and ammunition. By November, several panzer divisions smashed in Normandy were back at combat strength, positioned not merely to defend, but to strike. German record-keeping, even in defeat, remained meticulous. Post-war analyses of their order of battle show exactly what happened. Between September 5th and mid-October, roughly 11 divisions were transferred to the Western Front. From the Eastern Front, from occupation duties in Denmark and Norway, and from training areas inside Germany. Several of these were Panzer or Panzer Grenadier formations, with real armored strength. They were not flawless, not the elite of 1940, but they were intact, organized, and capable of stiffening a defense. In addition, a wave of new Volksgrenadier divisions was formed and sent west. These units were often lower quality, older men, very young recruits, convalescents pulled back from hospitals. Yet they could hold bunkers, operate artillery, and slow an enemy. In September, Germany had almost nothing in the west. By November, they had the equivalent of around 30 divisions worth of defensive capacity across key sectors, enough to man positions and create the first semblance of reserves. The most consequential result of Patton's pause was not merely that Germany survived September. It was that Germany gained the time required to plan an offensive of its own. The Ardennes operation, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. This was not an evit improvisation. It demanded weeks of stockpiling ammunition, assembling fuel, regrouping armored divisions, and concealing preparations from Allied eyes. The Germans would eventually commit 3 armies totaling roughly 250,000 men. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who later commanded the 5th Panzer Army in the Ardennes, stated after the war that such an operation would have been impossible if Third Army had continued driving in September. The troops and weapons needed for the counterattack would have been swallowed by the emergency of defending the Rhine. Fuel and ammunition would have been spent trying to stop Patton's columns. Surprise would have evaporated under the pressure of constant Allied movement. But the stabilization of the front, this pause bought by American logistics, gave Hitler's staff the breathing room to attempt something audacious. On December 16, 1944, the Germans struck in the Ardennes. At first, they achieved shocking surprise, driving a deep bulge into the American line. The battle cost the United States more than 80,000 casualties and delayed the Allied advance by weeks. That price did not change the war's outcome, but it changed who lived to see the end. When Third Army finally received enough fuel and supplies later in September, the battlefield had transformed. The Germans, who had been fleeing in panic, were now dug into prepared positions. The Siegfried Line was occupied. Artillery was registered. Minefields were planted. Strongpoints were linked. Patton resumed his push, but the nature of the fight was different. No longer a pursuit across open roads against scattered resistance, it became methodical assaults on fortified belts. Progress shrank from dozens of miles to hundreds of yards. Casualties climbed. Weather began to turn against the Allies, limiting air support and grinding movement into mud. There is a harsh poetry to that season. When Patton's columns were racing across France, the sun shone. Liberation felt like speed, like wind, like a future rushing forward. But when the supplies caught up and the advance resumed into Germany's defensive teeth, the rains came. Gray skies, cold ground, mud that swallowed boots and slowed tracks. The men who might have ended the war in late summer uniforms were now hunched in foxholes, shivering, listening to artillery, realizing that the easy war was gone. The grinding war had arrived. Blumentritt later noted that once the Siegfried Line was manned, Patton remained dangerous, but no longer unstoppable. Germany could trade space for time, conduct controlled withdrawals, and make the Americans pay for every kilometer. In early September, they could not have done any of that. They had been naked in the West, saved only by the enemy's need to pause. Patton would not cross the Rhine until March 22, 1945, more than 6 months after he had been within striking distance of it. By then, Germany was collapsing under pressure from both directions, and the war's end was visible even through the smoke. Patton knew what had been lost. In diary entries from March of 1945, he expressed frustration that the Rhine crossing had been delayed so long. He believed that if Third Army had reached the Rhine in September, German resistance in the West might have collapsed, and the war could have ended months earlier. Whether that is perfectly true in every detail is debated, but the Germans themselves, those who would have had to stop him, repeatedly said the same thing. They could not. After Germany's surrender, the United States Army conducted extensive interrogations of German commanders. The goal was not revenge, it was understanding how Germany made decisions, how it collapsed, and what lessons could be extracted for future wars. Those interrogations produced thousands of pages of testimony, much of it strikingly candid. The question of Patton's September halt appeared again and again, because American officers wanted to know whether an unbroken advance would have been feasible. The German answers were consistent. Rundstedt, Blumentritt, Westphal, and multiple subordinate commanders testified that Germany lacked the forces to stop Patton in early September. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, the chief of operations at Hitler's headquarters, was asked directly whether Germany could have prevented Patton from reaching the Rhine if Third Army had continued its push. According to interrogation records, Jodl stated that Germany had no reserves and the Siegfried Line was not properly manned. If Patton had continued, he would have reached the Rhine by mid-September at the latest. The testimony matters because it strips away comforting myths. It suggests that the key barrier to an earlier Rhine crossing was not German tactical brilliance in that moment, but the simple tyranny of supply. From the German perspective, the American pause created a chain reaction of possibilities. If Third Army had reached the Rhine in mid-September, German forces would have struggled to establish a coherent defense in time. The Siegfried Line could have been outflanked or penetrated before it became dangerous. Panzer divisions would not have had time to rebuild. The psychological shock of American forces reaching German soil in September rather than in spring would have been immense. Combined with Soviet pressure, in the east, it might have pushed Germany toward collapse earlier, perhaps by winter. Historians argue over exact timelines because history is not a clean equation. But what is undeniable is that German commanders, men who had every reason after the war to protect their reputations, described the early September situation as one in which they were nearly helpless. They were not claiming they were beaten by superior tactics in that window. They were admitting they were saved by time, and they drew lessons from it. In post-war writings and military studies, German officers emphasized operational tempo. When an enemy is collapsing, you do not give him a week, day, even an hour more than necessary. You keep pressure on until the collapse becomes irreversible. Blumentritt wrote tactical analyses treating September of 1944 as a case study in defensive recovery, how a shattered force can rebuild when the attacker pauses. His conclusion was blunt: logistics are essential, but they cannot be allowed to halt an army at the moment of decision. An army that stops gives its enemy the most precious gift in war: time. When asked years later to assess the significance of Patton's September pause, Blumentritt was unequivocal. He described it as one of the most important turning points in the Western campaign after Normandy. Patton had broken the back of German resistance. Germany was in headlong retreat. There was no coherent defense. And then the advance halted. Germany used those weeks as if each day were gold. They pulled in divisions from everywhere they could. They manned fortifications that had been empty. They rebuilt armored formations that would later strike in the Ardennes. By November, the West had a functioning defensive system again. None of that, the German commanders insisted, would have been possible if Patton had kept coming. That is the cruel truth at the heart of the September halt. German commanders did not believe they had been saved by their own brilliance in that moment. They did not credit themselves with a masterful defense. They believed they had been saved by the American decision to pause while supplies caught up. In their eyes, it was a reprieve without justification, an unexpected opening in a closing door, and they used it to extend the war by months. And months in war are not abstract. We speak of buying time as if time is currency spent on maps and in staff rooms. But in 1944, time was purchased with lives. The months Germany gained did not change the final outcome, but they changed who survived to see it. Because of that delay, tens of thousands of men, on both sides, who might have gone home in 1944, instead died in the Hürtgen forest, in the Ardennes snow, and on the bloody approaches to the Rhine. That is the weight of the pause. Not only a strategic mistake, but a human tragedy, one measured in empty chairs at kitchen tables and letters that never should have been written.